Good morning. It is Monday at 11 o'clock, and so we are going to start the Monday at 11 trending conversation in food production. My name is Alan Reed. I'm the Executive Director of the Chicagoland Food and Beverage Network, and I am so happy to have our friends from Bader Rutter here. They have an unbelievable tool in the Intel Distillery that takes a look at what food and ag influencers are talking about in social media, and we'll be using this conversation weekly to really talk about what are we seeing. And there's some surprising conversations and some things that won't be a surprise at all. We thank all of you for attending these virtual events. We strive to make these even better than just a regular webinar. We love webinars, but now anybody with a computer and a couch can do one. So we strive for a higher level. And the way that gets better is, first, we hope we have great content for you. Second, we want to hear from you on your questions. Please use you can use the Q&A or the chat function to send any of those questions through. Interactive is way better in terms of a webinar. We will try and get to all the questions that are asked as long as time allows. So we really appreciate your engagement with all of it. That is what makes for great content on this. So again, thrilled that all of you are here with us. And actually, we're going to test you out on if you can use your raise your hand button. So will you please raise your hand with your Zoom if this is the first Chicagoland Food and Beverage Network event you have attended? All right, am I seeing any? No, not very many. You probably can't even find the raise your hand button yet there. Okay, it looks like we have maybe a few, hard to tell. Well, anyway, so we are looking for that kind of interaction. So stick with us, terrific. Next slide, please. So for those of you who aren't familiar with the Chicagoland Food and Beverage Network, we are a mission-driven industry organization. We leverage the power of the food and beverage industry in Chicagoland to do a bunch of things: grow the industry, grow the local economy, and create jobs. At a time like we're living through now, this kind of connection, especially across an industry, is particularly important. It's easy to just sort of answer your email and sort of homeschool your kids and everything else, and forget just how important it is to remain connected to everybody else in industry, and also to remember that while we're living through difficult times now, they will end. There is a pot of gold at the end of the rainbow, and we will want to continue to innovate and move things forward. In case you haven't heard of it before, we also are operating a group called The Bigger Table. The Bigger Table brings together the food and beverage industry of Chicagoland to address very specific community efforts: food insecurity, unemployment, inclusive economic development, and others. First, take a look at that logo. Our good friends at Bader Rutter designed it for us, and we love it. But also, I would encourage you to learn more about what we're doing with Bigger Table, including our incredible efforts to actually bring food companies together to actually design products specifically for the food and beverage, the food banks here in the greater Chicagoland area, and much, much more to come on that. We, again, love engagement. Please follow us on social media if you haven't already. And if you are social media inclined, please feel free to tweet, Insta, Facebook, LinkedIn, all of the good stuff. Here's ours and Bader Rutter's social media tags. So we'd love to have a conversation with you there as well. And with that, I will introduce the terrific folks from Bader Rutter. Actually, allow you to introduce yourself and talk a little bit more about the Intel Distillery and what you're seeing happening in conversations this week.
Thank you, Alan. I might take issue with characterizing homeschooling as simple. It's been a nightmare, but small detail. Anyway, welcome to our webinar. Please, we really do hope we get a lot of interactivity with this. We want to go through this and just bring you up to speed on some things we're seeing in the industry through our Intel Distillery tool. Let me just start sharing this now. Hopefully you're seeing that. Is everyone seeing the, hopefully it's not up. So, okay. Let me share this screen. Here's a screen. Okay, there we go. How's that? Anyway, we started the Intel Distillery back in 2012. We use it to track the key stories from basically 1,500 of the most prominent, influential people in the food and beverage industries. These are industry influencers. They are not Kardashians. They are people we find to be most responsible for starting trends and conversations in food production. And we've tracked and logged their stories daily ever since. And we also kind of release quarterly analyses and things like that. Basically, how it works is we create two databases. One is of these influencers. These are the voices that matter. They can be people in government, in education, in manufacturing, in journalism. We take them, the ones we have ranked to be highest. We then add a database filled with stories that matter. We basically have about 50 subjects of food trends and sourcing and ingredients. Then we break those further down into subtopics. And right now we're running about 2,200 subtopics that we're keeping alive on a daily basis. Now we put that through some brain matter, which is our team here that you've got to get to know. They do the Boolean search, they do the sifting, the counting, the ranking, and they come up with really at the end, the information matter. These are the stories that are going to drive the market as things evolve. So that's what we do on a daily basis. Again, it happens all the time. It's been happening for 8 years now. In addition, we put out focus features. These are, every few months we put one out. We've talked about everything from private labeling to ingredient listing and worker issues. We've got one coming out towards the end of this month. You can probably guess what's going to be featured rather squarely in that, rather importantly. So if you subscribe to the Intel Distillery, you'll get that as well. But what we're here to do today is we're really to kind of review and then hopefully get some discussion going around what we just noticed last week. And to do that, last Friday, we released our Fridays by Noon. It was titled, Normalcy is a Stock Shelf. And to discuss this further, I want to introduce Nick Praznowski, who is the architect of the Intel Distillery and its chief editor. Nick.
Thank you, Dennis. Yes, as Dennis mentioned, Friday by Noon is our weekly catch-up that kind of describes what's happening throughout the food and agriculture continuum that we do put out every Friday by noon. It's a free and available for everyone to check out. It's kind of our toe in the water to some of the research and analysis that we do. And thanks CFBN and Alan for this opportunity. I'd like to continue to make this as useful as possible. So feedback is very welcome. We're going to run you through a short summary to catch up where we are, kind of look at some current issues that have been happening, and then hopefully get a little Q&A. But obviously, coronavirus has taken over, and I just wanted to give a quick overview of kind of how we got there since the beginning of the year. For maybe the past year, the types of issues that our database of the 1,500 most influential voices in food production have been talking about were things like plant-based protein alternatives. International trade has become a really big issue lately. Towards the beginning of the year, food manufacturers and channels were announcing CSR initiatives having to do with climate change, stuff like that. Those are some of the larger issues that we were witnessing, towards the end of 2019, beginning of 2020. But then, as a pretty good indicator of kind of how the whole food continuum is interrelated, the conversation about coronavirus / COVID-19 has really kicked up gradually since the beginning of the year to really overtake and dominate conversations. This is a chart where we looked at everything we track versus coronavirus. So this is coronavirus / COVID versus literally everything else, just to show the dramatic ramp up. Starting in January, we started hearing of things getting a little urgent in China. At that time, Ag Secretary Sonny Perdue committed to buying selling billions of U.S. agricultural products to China. They were closing stores. There's a lot of joking going around, with, Corona beer getting blamed for some of this, not a real sense that this was, ramping up to where it is now. Towards the beginning of March, our team was planning on hitting a lot of industry events. There was a political conference in Chicago. There was the annual meat conference in Nashville, and a couple of us were supposed to head out to Expo West in California. And these things toward the beginning of March were getting, gradually closed and, postponed. However, by mid-March, we started getting reports from the folks we track about, consumers doing more and more panic shopping, planning for changes in, food channels with things like contactless delivery, new logistics. But, by mid-March, things weren't really all encompassing yet. However, by late March, our team was forced to pivot about how we deliver our Fridays by Noon newsletter and how we kind of sum up the industry every week and really evaluate what's happening. I mean, everything, it seemed, or the majority of things, had been seen through the eyes of the coronavirus happening. And I think what we tried to do is just, report back how the industry is conversing the coronavirus through the various channels of folks that we track. So it could be food service and retail, it could be the government, could be academics, some of the folks that we track. So that's what we've been doing for the past couple of weeks. We're forcing to adapt to kind of interpret the industry for our readership, and hoping it's useful. Feel free to submit questions and just let us know how we can best explain what's happening. Okay, I'm going to turn it over to Kyle and Courtney, who are going to kind of go segment by segment, just to kind of recap what's been happening through the eyes of various channels that our organization tracks. Kyle?
All right. So I'm going to start out covering kind of the government response. These are the big hitters here. We're all familiar with some of the big relief efforts that the government has gone through. We've seen 3 parts go through Congress of relief packages, and President Trump has signed all into law. We have, for the food industry specifically, we have declarations that food producers and farmers are critical industries. We have additional funds delivered for providing like hunger relief, things like food stamps, child nutrition, stuff to support school lunches. And then additionally, in the most recent package, we have more of an approach to help businesses out. So there are a number of provisions provided. For restaurants, we have the closing of like a loophole in the tax code. They messed up when they reformed taxes a couple years ago, and something that was meant for restaurants to be able to write off upgrades to their businesses did not go into effect. They patched that out. They also provided approximately $350 billion in funds for small business loans. So it's not just open to restaurants, but it is going to be a big avenue for restaurants to recover costs. One of the concerns, though, is that is linked to payrolls for the previous year. So if your company has expanded, you could be facing difficulty. And additionally, it's like tied to monthly income. So it'll help out, but it's not going to cover everything. So there's at least efforts on that front. And then going further back on the supply chain, farmers got a lot of relief out of this. There's $9.5 billion in extra funds for livestock producers, specialty crop producers, which, for the record, specialty crops means things like apples and peaches. It just means not like row crops. And that will also help out things like farmers markets. And then there's another $14 billion in loans that will be available for farmers who are trying to buy seeds to plant things right now. Usually they do that on credit. So a lot of that effort will help get farmers going. during this time when money is going to be tight for everyone else otherwise. Additionally, we have some help from the FDA. They've got a few rules that they've said they will not be enforcing. They are not currently doing any inspections of main facilities in the US or externally in the international markets. And they will not be enforcing any regulations for if restaurants want to sell their stock as like a grocery store. Most of that food is labeled like specifically not for retail resale because it doesn't have a nutrition facts label. So they're trying to make it a little bit easier for restaurants to cope in a time of need. And then moving on to processors and manufacturers, the people who are turning raw products into food. We've got an array of responses here. We've got some issues with producers who are by default like larger than the maximum gathering sizes. So they've all had to deal with making sure that governments say it's okay for more than 50 people to be in one place producing food. But then again, that also makes them higher risk. So employees are worried about getting sick from going to work. And in fact, JBS, a major beef processor, has had to shut down a plant in Pennsylvania for 2 weeks because they have a couple dozen employees who've been sick. But you also have some companies who are pivoting and taking advantage of meeting needs. So General Mills CEO Jeff Hammerling has said that they're going to reduce the number of products they're producing and instead focus on staples, so like canned soups, to help meet things that they see more people buying. And additionally, Unilever has shifted to producing more like large box sizes rather than the small single serving sizes because people are staying at home with their whole families now instead of trying to eat on the go as much. We've also seen alcohol producers shift to making hand sanitizer, which still has an alcohol as a main ingredient, but how they produce it does differ. Separately, we've also seen Pepsi, Nestle, and several other large manufacturers offer additional benefits and higher pay to their workers to compensate for any perceived danger that they have there. And despite all of this, a lot of companies are running higher production. So Kraft is running full-time, 24-hour, like 3 shifts every day of the week. It's been a challenge for manufacturers to make sure they can still meet needs, but also know that they have to change their products on a short time frame. So next is Courtney here. I'll let you tackle your part.
All right. So I'm gonna cover what's been going on with industry orgs and advocacy groups, as well as trends we're seeing in the culinary space and for food shopping. As far as industry orgs go, we're seeing, the majority of orgs using their platforms to advocate for their members and the different workers in these sectors. For example, the United Food and Commercial Workers Union has been extremely vocal, releasing different letters and pleas to different government organizations asking for worker protections and things like, paid time off and healthcare, personal protective equipment for workers who are coming into contact with a bunch of people, like grocery workers and people who work in fast food, different masks and facial shields, things like that. And then you also have people like the Teamsters who are going in and speaking to companies directly, making sure their different members and the employees at places like grocery stores and factories aren't getting their hours cut and are able to receive hazard pay and, can pretty much operate without too much loss of income, even in the crisis. As far as industry orgs for different food and commodity-based groups, you've got people like the National Pork Producers Council speaking out to make sure you keep the meat supply flowing. And like Kyle mentioned, the workers in those factories where it's going to require more than 50 people to be in pretty tight spaces, that they're able to stay safe without causing too much disruption to the supply chain. You've also got the Farm Bureau who's speaking out to make sure farmers were included. Farmers, small and large, were included in that stimulus bill. As Kyle mentioned, they did a pretty good job because there are billions of dollars being funneled into that industry. And then you've got the restaurant workers. they did not receive as much of the stimulus bill as they were initially asking for. So you've got people like the NRA, as well as different advocacy groups like Jose Andres's World Central Kitchen, doing individualized efforts and asking for donations from the greater public to make sure that restaurant workers are able to sustain during this time until we get through it and see what's gonna happen and who's gonna be able to reopen, who's been furloughed, who's been laid off, etc. And then when you get into the culinary space and more food shopping and what people are shopping for, obviously, as this continues to ramp up, consumers are going to continue to be more nervous, and that's causing them to go stockpile. It becomes a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy. There's absolutely enough food in the supply chain and the food system to sustain us, but people are nervous and people want to make sure that they're okay and they're prepared for a 2-week or longer quarantine in the house. So people are stockpiling items like stuff to bake with. People are doing a lot of stress baking, and we're seeing shortages of wheat and yeast and flour and baking products and supplies and stuff like that. Also, just a ton of content. If you've been on the internet at all, I'm sure you've seen a recipe for a sourdough starter. If any, I haven't started my sourdough starter, but kudos to any of you who have. Just other cooking and baking projects that they have probably been putting off and now have all the time in the world to do because they're in the house. You've also got people stockpiling cuts of meat. Meat sales are all the way up, and people are, freezing them and putting them aside for later. But that means other meats like bacon, which, don't freeze as well or are more popular in food service as a topping on a burger or, wrapped around a date or something like that. People aren't necessarily frying up a bunch of bacon in their house. So we've seen sales of meat up, sales of bacon down. Ironically, there's a little bit of a breakfast theme here. We've also seen sales of eggs all the way up. People, it's an easy source of protein, and also it's used in all that stress baking that people have going on. So there's almost an egg shortage, which is surprising because there should be more than enough to get us through. In a surprising twist, orange juice is actually the hottest commodity of Q1. People want to make sure they got that vitamin C, and they're keeping their immune system healthy. So people are buying up a ton of frozen and fresh orange juice. What else? If you follow any of your favorite cooking influencers, you'll see a ton of quarantine cooking content. If you ever wanted to watch, Gordon Ramsay or whoever cook live, now's the chance. Everyone's on Instagram Live and YouTube and doing different, virtual and live platforms as we are doing today to make sure they can stay connected with their audience. And also that's, I've heard a lot of chefs say that's just how they feel they can contribute. Like they're stuck at home. They, can't go to the restaurants are closing, and cooking has sort of become a refuge for everybody in this time, consumers and chefs alike. And that is pretty much it. I'm going to pass it off to Nick, and he's going to discuss channels, I believe.
Sure. And we do have one question out there. We'll get to that in just a quick second. Channels are, Courtney mentioned a lot of it. Channels would mean food service and retail. Lots of attention there, and the word I would use to describe what's going on in channels to consumers is just it's completely upside down right now. Chicken prices are bottoming out because restaurants aren't serving wings and boneless, skinless chicken breast. Farmers are dumping their milk because schools are closed and no one's buying milk. Like Courtney said, pork belly, there's an oversupply because no one's eating bacon in restaurants, egg shortages, etc. So the line is really blurring even more than recently between food service and retail. The most recent economist report I saw just said that retail is going to need to need to sell more than 20% more volume, which is out of this world increased. This morning, Dan Charles, someone we follow from NPR who writes a lot about food, just says there's too much food in the wrong place. And that kind of sums up what's happening in channels. A lot of our shift is going to go towards workers. More on that in a second, but just like the supply may get affected a little bit. Sanderson Farms, a big chicken producer, reported multiple workers sick on their lines. This morning, we caught report of a Trader Joe's employee dying of COVID-19. So the focus on frontline workers is going to be more and more important as we move through this. So real quick, the one question on the FDA, Kyle was going to take that one, and then I think we can move on through the agenda and look at some more questions.
Sure. The
Repeat the
question here, so everyone knows, is what do you feel would be the long-term impact of our foods not being regulated by the FDA? And I think the easiest way for me to think about this is to reflect back to last year when the federal government shut down. So for the entire month of January of 2019, the FDA was basically unfunded apart from what they considered to be essential services. Turns out that food facility inspections are not considered essential services, which is just mind-blowing. But a big thing that came up in the process of that, a lot of reporters focused on this, is it's that the FDA does something like, I don't know, a dozen inspections of facilities a week. It's just a baffling low number for the number of producers out there, people who are turning ingredients into food products. So a lot of times facilities don't expect to be audited for years at a time. And when it happens, it's a big deal. But then you might expect a follow-up as a result. So I think for the short term, if the coronavirus lasts for like 2 months roughly of services reduced, what we'll see is, yes, a number of facilities won't get inspected for this time, but the difference for each individual facility is very minimal. Most of these facilities, it'll just be, they'll get a couple extra months of leeway on the safety of, or like the certification for their building. And operations will return to usual. So I think the long term, it won't be a huge change from norm.
That's terrific. Thank you for the question, Tracy. Eric Olson just put one in. He writes, I work at a Florida port. We import a large percentage of fruits and vegetables from Latin America and the Caribbean. What do you see happening with fresh produce now that the hotels, restaurants, and theme parks are closed? Will the fresh market suffer from price drops and or canceled orders? Nick, do you want to discuss this, or that makes sense?
Usually the agricultural reports focus on row crops. I think it all just goes back to this question about fresh produce goes back to the balance between food service and retail. If they could repackage the food service foods to make it into retail stores, it's more possible. As far as the international trade goes, I mean, we're behind where China was, say 2 months ago with this, and there were problems with exports going into China in terms of just workers at the docks not being available to accept foods. And right now, it might be a little bit too early to say what's going to happen. In California and New York, the big points of entry for this produce, are dock workers going to be able to accept it? I don't know. We have to see how this is going to play out.
Are there other questions? Vesna Blackman, I see you have your hand raised. I'm not sure if that's a question. That's a question or not. Other questions? So I think what you were saying about meat is up but bacon is down. Are there other examples of that? Because I'd say just again, my local grocery store, we're not seeing shortages, but we're certainly seeing shortages of some things. And when will people stop buying toilet paper?
That's a great question. I would love to know, because I'm down to like 2 or 3 rolls, so I'm going to be on the hunt later this week. I have more so seen reports of like specific cuts of meat, being up and down, like things that people grill, like flank steaks and like outer cuts and ribs and stuff like that are selling a lot slower than big pot roasts and like heavy cuts of red meat that you can freeze and preserve for later. And also we are not seeing as much plant-based food being purchased now that people are locking themselves inside their homes. I know a couple months back, as we were tracking the news, a lot of reports were saying that many plant-based sales were based on just kind of like curiosity and people, you know, wanting to incorporate it slowly into their diet, but not necessarily using it as an altogether meat substitute. So it feels like now that people are having to make some decisions about what's going to be essential and what groceries they need to be able to hold themselves down for 2 weeks, that curiosity has kind of gone out the window and we're kind of going back to basics, you know, orange juice, eggs, milk, meat, beef, chicken, that kind of stuff.
And because I'm a bright side kind of guy, you know, what are the funniest things that you're seeing? Are there things that are hilarious? And if you can't come up with something funny, tell me what you're stress baking.
I got one. First of all, Ina Garden, as much as we love her, she made a giant Cosmopolitan for brunch. It was like a Tuesday, like just like a giant Cosmo in the middle of a Tuesday. And it's actually, I feel like maybe Dennis has reviewed it and he said it's like a legit Cosmo recipe. So Ina is out here. Is it good?
Look it up. It is. It's been our long-standing Cosmo recipe. It's fantastic.
She's relating to the people. She also came out with a ramen noodle recipe, which is literally the only one on her site. Like you can go back through the archives and she has not ever mentioned the word ramen, but she's trying to like, you know, get with the stockpiling vibes, make herself one of the people. So I thought that was pretty hilarious. Ina Garden is like a, you know, the Gordon Ramsay of fresh ingredients. And now she's out here with us plebeians.
There's a really interesting question, and I either Kyle or Nick, I thought this was fascinating. What are some legal protections or protocols that restaurants are taking right now to protect themselves? Does anyone have any advice or suggested resources, particularly here in Chicago?
I'm reading the question. Legal protection that restaurants are taking. Well, I mean, there is, you know, new legislation passed even before the bailout took place in terms of, you know, small businesses needing to cover every employee. I think it was up to $500 a day for up to 2 weeks to take care of yourself, and $200 for family members. And right now, I mean, the latest reports about this in terms of small businesses and the bailout, you know, this was since yesterday. I haven't read the coverage yet, but I mean, there's just a lot of confusion and controversy over what defines a small business and who's going to get what. So I think some of those resources is, you know, call your lawyer, and you know, just follow the interpretations of the federal guidelines as much as possible. I mean, I think, you know, the blur is amazing right now. Question about Costco's performance. Nothing exactly, Ken. Ken asks, have you any insight on Costco's performance? I heard they're postponing POs because sales have been declined. I haven't seen any direct coverage on that right now.
No.
I can say that Costco does have lots of toilet paper, so if you're in need, check that out.
Great to know. I might need for you to vouch for me to get in the front door.
Yeah. I know early on they definitely had boosted sales from people who were stocking up on large items, specific SKUs. But my guess is that you know, based on demand, they're going to be having a tough time finding things. They did not have any flour of any sort when I was there yesterday.
That's wild.
Which is tough because I would like to be baking, and I can't. So.
Go gluten-free, Kyle. Go gluten-free.
All almond flour.
Get yourself some cassava flour, Kyle.
There you go.
Flourless chocolate cake.
Mm-hmm.
I also wonder, just and again, it's an observation, so I don't have any data around this. I wonder whether Costco got a big bump in terms of the initial pantry stocking, and then not. I just don't know how many times I need to go back to a Costco, which is, my neighborhood is a madhouse.
Yeah.
So if we are truly serious about social distancing, Costco is like the last place I want to be. And choosing smaller, more local stores, first, just to keep them in business. And second, because if, like, again, if we're serious about this, Costco is like, it's a really crowded place, even with all the social distancing that they put in place. And again, we stocked up on the Costco things early on, and probably don't need to go back there for a couple of months at this point. I wonder if others are having that same experience.
Somewhat related to that, Alan, this question about, are there any new guidelines or best practices for food manufacturers to reduce the risk of having employees that could be sick working in plants? Again, we're all playing catch up on that, but Kyle or Nick, I know you guys focus on this. Is there anything you've been seeing?
I can speak to that a little bit. I know that, so my wife works at Farmer's Fridge, which helps me with a little bit of insight here. I know that they have changed how they are doing their production so that people are guaranteed to be at least 6 feet apart. And they've taken some more protocols just to make sure that, if someone gets sick on the line, then they don't have to take out every worker on the line. A lot of the best practices have to do with the social distancing. And if you see, if anyone is experiencing symptoms, they've been a lot better about making sure to tell people, like, if you got symptoms, stay home, or make sure you see your doctor and get this checked out so that we know how to address the issue from here.
Mm-hmm. And not so much food manufacturers, but I know not all of, but a lot of the major grocery store chains I've seen have gotten the Insta-read thermometers and are doing temperature checks on employees before they enter the front door. And if it's over, I want to say 100.1, then it's, deemed like asymptomatic or an early sign that you may possibly be infected, and they're having people stay home or turn back around.
I think that's still sort of playing itself out, but I've certainly heard social distancing where they can in plant, as well as daily temperature take, as well as not penalizing if you don't show up for work, to ensure that the incentives aren't going the wrong way. One challenge is I just don't think that those things are getting discussed in social media. I think those things are getting discussed, I'll say, more in, some smaller groups. Luckily, I've been a party to some of those. And there's quite a bit of confusion. Everybody wants to do right by their employees, but I think it's difficult to figure, to strike that balance. And I think companies are really struggling through that. Do we have other questions? Dennis, what do you stress baking?
Being a diabetic, I don't really stress bake, but I've got a daughter who is very heavily, so we've had Russian tea cakes, we've had Czechoslovakian jelly bars, we are getting butterscotch refrigerated cookies today. So I'm just going through insulin at a Kitty Von Bulow level.
Just leave the treats at the door. Just leave them at the door.
Exactly. That's literally, that's a good point.
Wait for you to retreat and I'll go retrieve them, just for your safety and well-being, because I care.
Any other questions? Okay, any other thoughts from our Intel Distillery folks?
Sure.
Well, thank you for attending. I think it's great, Nick.
Oh, thank you, sir. Thanks everyone for attending. Just to keep everyone up to speed with what's happening here, an interesting observation that we're going to be spelling out in much greater detail. It was relevant to most of the conversation we've had today, but the impact on workers in the workforce has been the number one, most aggressively, approached issue in all of this. Last week's Friday by noon, we focused a lot on workers throughout the, food production system, from the farm to the factory to food service. All of them along the way. We do a quarterly tally of conversations that we're going to spell out in some great detail over the next couple weeks. But the issue of workers and employee relations has never nearly approached our top 10 topics in all the years that we've done this. And this quarter alone, it has strongly risen up to really take over the conversation about coronavirus and COVID-19. So, you know, there's a lot of detail in last week's edition. If you didn't get it, please do subscribe. But I mean, we're really trying to understand this from all the different perspectives and how, you know, frontline workers are impacted at all levels. And this is the commanding conversation in all of food production. So more on that to come. You know, we are working out our quarterly report that's going to put this all into perspective of how this, you know, at least in food production, it's obviously the big conversation, the dominant conversation globally, but, you know, to hone in on food and especially on workers, I think it would be interesting to see how that plays out. So stay tuned. We'll be talking this through week to week.
So just to make sure everyone knows how to subscribe to the newsletter, which comes out Friday by noon, how do you go do that?
Good question. You can go to theinteldistillery.com, and I think you answer 2 questions. What's your name and what's your email? And this will start showing up free of charge every Friday by noon.
Terrific.
Thanks,
Thank
Alan.
you all for your insights. I think we see you next Monday.
That'd be great. And again, if anyone has seen anything today and it sparks something they'd like us to address or specifically look into, that's one of the capabilities we have at the Intel Distillery. If you want us looking into any specific issue, let us know and we'll try to get that prepared for next Monday.
Terrific. Thanks, Dennis, Nick,
Thank you.
Courtney, Kyle. Thank you.
Thanks
Thanks, everyone.
And thanks everyone for tuning in. Again, we'll be back next Monday and catching up on exactly what's happening with the thought and opinion leaders in food and beverage, I'm sorry, ag, food and beverage manufacturing in social media. Thank you again, and we'll talk soon.
Bye, guys.
Take care. Bye, everyone.